Hello everyone, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, and today I'm going to be doing kind of a summary of an article that I recently wrote. This article is called Thinking Outside the Box, Some Remarks Concerning the Biblical Chronology. This article took, frankly, quite a bit of time, and I'm going to be summarizing it for you guys. If you want all the details, the article is in the link as well as the PowerPoint slides, so you guys can go ahead and take a look at that. But basically, this article is basically a reconsideration of the biblical chronology. And I've done PowerPoints and presentations on the biblical chronology before, but I've recently done a little bit more work on some of the textual variants involved and things like that, and done a little bit more thorough analysis of some things. As well as also seeing some presentations made by other people regarding the biblical chronology that caused me to rethink some things. So all of those things put together, I am revising my understanding of the biblical chronology, and thereby hopefully helping you guys understand the biblical chronology better. Alright, so let's talk about the background of this in a little bit more detail. The background for why I called the article the way it is, and some of the things that get mentioned in it, have to do with two things, the Ark Encounter and also Peter Williams. Alright, so the Ark Encounter. The Ark Encounter is put out by AIG, Answers in Genesis, and it is a biblical theme park that is going to feature a full-sized replica of Noah's Ark. And what is interesting about it is that AIG has done a lot of really cool things recently in defending the biblical point of view. The God who is creator, who created when he said he did, how he said he did, those kinds of things. Done lots of cool things, and one of the coolest things that they're doing right now is building a full-size replica of Noah's Ark, which is just amazing in every sense. However, they did not rebuild Noah's Ark in the way that most people think of Noah's Ark. That is, a lot of people have wound up with some preconceptions about Noah's Ark based on work that other people have done in the past. And these other people who have done work in the past, I'm not saying that they're bad or anything like that, but they were very deep. They were basically just kind of not tentative, but what they were working with what they had at the time. It was the best that those early people had to work with. However, AIG, in going back and looking over some of the research and some of the history and some of the things that occurred in history with ancient ships and shipbuilding techniques and all these kinds of things, have come to the conclusion that some things are different about the Noah's Ark than is typically said. For example, a lot of people will typically say that Noah's Ark was 450 feet long. And that is based on the idea of a cubit being about 18 inches. Well, that's the problem. The cubit that the Hebrews wound up using eventually was 18 inches, but early on, there are other cubits that are in existence that are a little bit longer. For example, one of the earlier cubits was about 22 inches. And so the further back in time you go, you wind up getting larger distances and larger cubit sizes, and of course that means that the whole structure is going to become significantly larger. So the Answers in Genesis Noah's Ark actually winds up being over 500 feet long instead of the usual 450 feet that's usually cited. So that's different. They also have a very different structure and overall shape. The Answers in Genesis one actually looks a lot like a ship, and rather than something that's more barge-like. And that also has to do with consideration of various things that would have been at play during the flood and things like that. So overall, when everything is said and done, you wind up with something that is still consistent with the biblical model, but it's still very different from what most people are used to. And I'm using this kind of as a jumping off point for my own chronology because it's different from what most people would expect. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's counter-biblical. In fact, I've tried to stay very close to the Bible in every respect that I could and to research it very thoroughly. But the problem is that when you start researching things very thoroughly is that sometimes you find things that other people haven't found before, they didn't compile together and put together and all these kinds of things. When you do that, your model changes. And the biblical chronology is a model. All young Earth creationists, including myself, believe that the Earth is young, somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 years old, definitely less than 10,000. But within that range, there's a little bit of debate that can happen about certain things, and that's what we're talking about, is evaluating those areas of dispute and trying to figure out what is the most original. Not what is most expected, not what people have come to accept, but what is most original. That's what AIG tried to do with their Ark Encounter, and frankly I think they did a pretty good job. And it's also what I'm trying to do with the biblical chronology that I'm putting out there for you guys. The other part of this, the other reason why that my article has the subtitle that it does, is because of the work of a fellow by the name of Pete Williams. He wrote some time back, that was called Some Remarks Preliminary to a Biblical Chronology, which, as the title might sound like, was a fairly academic paper. And fairly academic papers usually do not have the most exciting titles of all. But Pete Williams is actually one of my favorite speakers to listen to. A wonderful scholar, brilliant guy, and frankly with a lot of things I would completely agree with him. However, in his article he said a few things that on the one hand he brought up because they need to be dealt with, and I'm glad that he did that. At the same time he also said a few things that I don't completely agree with. And I hope that people understand when they read the article and they listen to the rest of this presentation that I'm not trying to bash on Pete Williams. He just happened to be the unfortunate person whose article I happened to find and respond to. Peter Williams really is an excellent scholar and has a lot of great contributions, and frankly on most things he and I would agree. The reason why we're disagreeing on this particular issue is because, for one, it has to do with numbers, and I'm a numbers guy. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm a numbers guy, and so I get really picky about it, whereas most other people who deal with the Bible and are scholars typically usually default to one textual version over another, and Pete Williams tends to default to the Masoretic text. That's usually his go-to, and most of the time that I would say that the Masoretic text is pretty accurate. But when it comes to numbers, there's a few things that are just kind of weird about the Masoretic text that makes it a little bit less reliable than normal in those cases. But nonetheless, he kind of laid the groundwork for this in laying out a bunch of things that chronologists need to respond to, and especially those of us who are young Earth Christians need to respond to and need to deal with. And so I hope that people understand that I'm disagreeing with him in certain areas. That does not mean that I disagree with him on the whole. He's a wonderful guy. And I also hope that people understand that this is how models progress. Somebody puts out an idea and somebody says, well, here's the other side of the coin. And that's what I'm doing right now. I'm offering the other side of the coin, and in future time somebody will probably offer the other side of the coin to what I have to say, and that's how things go. And that's okay. And like I said, this is meant to be an overview. I know I'm talking a lot, but it's meant to just be an overview, so I'm going to go through what the article entails here pretty quickly. Alright, so the first thing that the article deals with is the issue of the Second Kenan. That is, in the Septuagint, the LXX, that's its abbreviation. There is a Kenan or Kenan, depending on whether you want to use the Greek pronunciation or a Hebrew variant that's been put into English, that English-speaking people can pronounce, or whatever you want to say. But in any case, there is an extra dude after Arpachshad in the Septuagint that causes some concerns. If he's original, that means you have to basically insert an extra slot in the patriarchal chronology. If not, well then you don't. So, do I believe that the Second Kenan that shows up in the Septuagint is original? No, I do not. I don't believe that he's was originally in the chronology at all. And there's a few things that tip you off to the fact that he's not original. First, Kenan II's info is copied from Shelah. That's the person right after him in the genealogy. It basically took all of Shinah's genealogical information and literally copied and pasted it for Kenan. I don't know about you guys, but I, of course, used to teach, and copying and pasting is one thing that teachers get to become very wary of. You learn to recognize it when it happens, because students have the bad habit of doing it fairly often. And it's a very clear sign that something has been fabricated the vast majority of the time. Now, is it possible that this Kenan could have existed and he just happened to have the exact same genealogical information as the person after him? It's possible, but extremely unlikely. But that's not the only bit of evidence that is against this second Kenan. Another thing that's against him is that he's not found in First Supplements in the Septuagint. First Supplements is basically the same thing as First Chronicles that most Protestants would be aware of. First Chronicles starts out with a genealogy that begins with Adam. First Supplements does the same thing, and it includes everybody else in the genealogy except for this second Kenan, which means that whoever added him in remembered to add him in Genesis, but they forgot to add him in First Supplements. Another thing is to keep in mind is that he's not found in any other version of the Old Testament. He's not found in the Masoretic text. He's not found in the Samaritan Pentateuch. He's not found anywhere, except in one part of the Septuagint. Like I said, he's found in Genesis. He's not found in First Supplements. And another thing that's also interesting is he's not found in the early versions of the Septuagint. There are actually numbers that were taken from the Septuagint version that we find in early Church Fathers' writings. I'm talking specifically about Julius Africanus, who did a chronology of the world as well. So I'm following in the footsteps of a great many people who talk about these things, but he did a chronology of the world, and the numbers that he used were actually different from the modern Septuagint numbers. And on top of that, his chronology does not include the second Kenan, meaning that it wasn't in the text at his time. So all of that put together pretty clearly says to me that the second Kenan is not authentic. Alright, second issue, the Patriarchs. The big issue here is what set of ages is correct for the Patriarchs, because there's lots of different versions and they all have different numbers. So which numbers do you use? Which version do you use? Well, none of them. None of the versions are correct. There's actually problems with all of the patriarchal genealogies. In one of the forms, you have Shem and Eber outliving multiple successive generations. In fact, I think Shem winds up living long enough to bury like the 9th generation after him is just huge. I mean, he outlives his great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson, or something like that. It's just fantastically huge. And granted, the Patriarchs did live for a long time, don't get me wrong on that. So you would expect them to see a lot of successive generations, or at least it's possible to see a good number of them. But you wouldn't expect them to outlive many successive generations, and that's exactly what happens in one version. Another interesting thing that happens in a couple of the versions is you have flood year stoppages. That is, what seems to happen is that the time from creation to the flood wound up getting shifted in some of them, such that the flood was closer to the time of creation. And given that the overall ages were the same as they were before, you wound up with people who were living after the flood, so scribes came in later and corrected those total ages back down so that the people wouldn't live past the flood. And so you have people who wind up dying in the exact year of the flood because the scribes didn't want them to go past. That's a pretty clear sign that there were some errors that crept into the text earlier. And of course, the fact that you're adjusting for the flood year itself is obviously an unoriginal thing and represents a change. But of course, one of the weird things about that is that if the scribes are recognizing that you can't live past the flood, that means two things. First of all, they're adding up the chronologies just like modern young Earth creationists do. Second of all, they obviously believe that the flood was a catastrophic event that only Noah and his family survived. And that's really interesting historically, meaning that the early Jews and Christians were young Earth creationists, just like I am a modern young Earth creationist. I follow in the footsteps of the people who came before me and the people who are roughly contemporaneous with Christ and the early disciples. This seems to be what they believed. And if my dedication is to my faith, then I'm going to try to believe what the founder of my faith believed, Christ and the apostles, and this is very clearly what they believed. This is what you have happening in that time period. Another weird thing that happens is you wind up with chronologies that have this weird bent behavior to them. And the bent behavior is probably due to the nature of the text itself. That is, you have pre-flood patriarchs and you have post-flood patriarchs, and in the text of Genesis they're separated by several chapters. And so alterations that happen in one don't always happen in the other. And so the fact that there have been alterations winds up showing up pretty obviously when you actually plot it out, because it'll look bent. You'll have changes on one side that won't occur on the other side because they're separated by several chapters. And so you wind up with this bent behavior, and it becomes really clear that something has been altered there. And then there's also a version in which you have patriarchs that were not flood corrected. They weren't stopped at the flood, but instead they were allowed to outlive the flood. And that's also pretty weird too. That's obviously a problem for someone who takes the text seriously, because the text is really clear that this was a devastating event. And so that's not something you would expect. That definitely poses some difficulty. So in the net effect, none of the versions are accurate, but we'll go through the versions anyways. Alright, first version, and this is the Masoretic chronology. This is the one that most people actually have in their Bibles, but it's usually not plotted out like this. They read off the number of years. And what you can see is that this is definitely one of the bent ones. You have this fairly slow slope going up to the flood, and the flood is that purple line, that purple-pink line. I guess you might call it magenta or something. I think it's a little bit more on the purple side, but that's a whole other issue. But you have this gradual increase that's going up. And then once you get past the flood, it tapers off, and in fact, with regard to the ages at which people die, you actually have people who are earlier, Shem and Eber, who actually wind up outliving multiple successive generations until you get to the time of Abraham. So the chronology actually winds up going backwards in history through a time. And then it starts picking up again after Abraham, which is obviously a little bit of a problem. And another thing that you have going on in the Masoretic chronology is that Methuselah is flood stopped. His age coincides perfectly with the flood, which is a really strong indication that a scribe came along later and adjusted something so that he wouldn't die at a time that was after the flood. So Methuselah is flood stopped. That's a sign of alteration. The overall behavior is bent. That's a sign that one part of Genesis was altered and the other part wasn't. And of course it can go back and forth, and there's recombination and these kinds of things, but there's definitely a difference that happens. And then we also have patriarchs who wind up outliving multiple successive generations of patriarchs, which is not something that you would expect in a normal genealogy. In a normal genealogy, you would expect that as you go from one generation to the next, that you would be progressively moving through history, or at least for the most part. You might have a case where a parent buries their child, which is of course sad, but you wouldn't expect it to happen for, 9 generations or 6 generations or something like that. That would just be weird. Alright, this one is the Samaritan Pentateuch, and it has some issues as well. When you look at the pre-flood patriarchs, one of the things that you notice about them compared to the post-flood patriarchs is that their line is kind of shallow. When you look at when they show up in the chronology, they're all pretty close to each other. And the fact that they're so close to each other actually wound up moving the flood down closer to the point of creation, which meant that you had the problem of some people living longer than the flood, so scribes had to come back and cut off those ages. Specifically, Jared, Methuselah, and Lamech are all flood stopped in the Samaritan Pentateuch. It was a bit of a problem with the Masoretic text with Methuselah. With the Samaritan Pentateuch, it's a major problem. You have this happening to 3 of the pre-flood patriarchs, which is a very clear sign that something went wrong in the pre-flood numbers. Something very major went wrong in the pre-flood numbers. Now, in the post-flood area, it's a little bit harder to tell because there's nothing really to compare it to. There's no cutoff points like the flood that you can't live past. And so it's a little bit hard to say what happened over there. But it does seem to have a little bit more slope to it than the pre-flood sequence does. So that's still an indication that there are different things that are going on either side. In either case, not all that accurate. Then there's the Septuagint. And the Septuagint doesn't have some of the problems that the other ones do. You don't have any flood stoppages, for example, and you don't have people outliving multiple successive generations and things like that. It doesn't have a generally bent behavior either. Instead, it has a little bit of a decay. It kind of starts to trail off at the end, but that's what you would expect with the effects of the fall. That is, one of the effects of the fall would be the general decay of things, including your lifespan. So as you go through time, you expect that the lifespan is going to get shorter and shorter, and that's going to cause the genealogy to curve just a little bit, but it's not actually forcefully bent like the Masoretic text is or like the Samaritan Pentateuch is. So that's good, but you still have some problems in the Septuagint. You don't have some problems, but you do have others. One of them is that you have this extra Kenan who shows up after Arpachshad and before Shelah, and like I said, the textual support for him is very, very, very minor. In fact, most of the textual evidence would indicate that he's not original. But he does show up, and that's obviously a bit of an issue that you have to deal with. And then there's also a weird thing that happens with Methuselah. Whereas in the Masoretic text and then the Samaritan Pentateuch, you have the scribes being very concerned about people outliving the flood. In the Septuagint, you don't have people who are concerned about outliving the flood. Instead, Methuselah is allowed to outlive the flood by 14 years. Now, granted, if you actually look at the Genesis text, that is not what you would derive from it. And like I said, the vast majority of the early scribes that we have and the vast majority of the early chronologists who looked at it definitely view the flood as a real event that nobody has survived. What we have here going on with the Septuagint is that people just simply didn't bother to count it up. And so Methuselah is allowed to outlive the flood by 14 years, and no one's the wiser. If you don't add it up and actually see where he falls, you don't know, and there's nothing to correct. There's no perceived error. So this is actually an error only for us who actually add it all up and look at it. Obviously, the final form of the Septuagint was not something that was corrected in this way. Okay. But you still have Methuselah living past 14 years. You still have the extra Kenan. And so, even with that, there are still issues with the Septuagint text as well. So all of them got issues. They all got problems. So what's the solution? What do you do? Well, the first thing that you want to do, and this is what I do in the article, is I establish which version is the most authentic. That is not completely authentic, but what is most authentic. It's pretty clear that none of them are completely authentic. But you go through and you establish which one is the most authentic. And for most textual critics, this is a major problem because a lot of textual critics, sadly today, don't actually take the text of Genesis seriously. And so for them, it's basically a toss-up, and you go with whichever one kind of tends to meet your expectations. And more likely, and more often than not, it winds up being the Masoretic text, because it's the version that is usually trusted everywhere else, although not completely everywhere else. There's a few places where the Masoretic text seems to be defective, but for the most part, people trust the Masoretic text, and so when it comes to this issue, they could just kind of default to the Masoretic text and leave well enough alone. But like I said, there's some issues with the Masoretic text. There's issues with all of the different versions of the patriarchal genealogy. Like I said, that there's a little bit of a problem there. It's just a default. They're defaulting to this rather than actually thinking it through and actually looking at what you would expect. Now, if you take the text of Genesis seriously, what you expect, first of all, is that these are real people, and their real ages have been recorded. And these real people whose real ages have been recorded are a part of a real population. And under that assumption, you can actually pick one of these versions out as being better than the other ones. I'm not necessarily going to say what it is. Read the article if you want to find out. But you actually can do that. But that's assuming that the text is meant to be taken basically literally. That it means what it says and it says what it means. If you are willing to accept that, then you can make a decision and you can go from there. If not, it's basically, pick whichever version seems like it's the best and go from there. But once you get this most authentic version down, and like I said, it's most authentic, it's not completely authentic, but most authentic, then you have an idea of what the original looked like, you have an idea of what the variants are, and you can start piecing all the information together to reconstruct the original. And specifically when it comes to textual reconstruction, what you're trying to do is create a chain of causality. That is, if you have this variant that's caused by this other variant that's caused by this other variant, and you go through this chain, the one that's at the very end of the chain, the one that is the cause of the cause of the cause of the cause, the one that's behind all the other causes, is the one that's most likely to be original. So the one that explains everything else is the one that's original. And so what I do is I go through all the various changes that happen, accounting for what happens in the Septuagint, what happens in the Samaritan Pentateuch, all of those different things. I go through all of those different variants in the article, and I create a proposed original genealogy that can explain all of the other variants that happen. And in so much as it can explain all of the other variants, it commends itself as the original. Now, can I put that forward with 100% confidence? No. However, I can say that it's really, 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 really likely to be the original based on the evidence that we have. So provided you actually assume that the text says what it means it says what it means and it means what it says, and you're interested in that which best explains everything else, the proposed original genealogy that I come up with has a very high likelihood of in fact being the original. And if you're interested in more details about it, look at the description of this video and check out the links. Alright, and then we have the sojourn. This is referring to the sojourn of the Hebrews in Egypt before the Exodus. And this is an issue for chronologists because there's a little bit of dispute about where you start computing the sojourn from. The sojourn was 430 years, and some people say that you should start counting that when Abraham enters Canaan, and some people say that it's, with Jacob entering or perhaps somebody else or anything in between. But the two major ones that happen are either when Abraham enters Canaan or when Jacob enters when Jacob enters Egypt. Those are the two options. And the one where you start counting the years from Abraham is the one that troubles me. That is, if you're still going to start counting from Abraham, you have a problem with the text of Genesis itself, because in Genesis chapter 15, God speaks to Abraham and he tells him about this sojourn that's going to happen. He tells him about their time of captivity. And God specifically says to Abraham, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there. And they, not you, will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterwards they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace." The plainest reading of the text would say that the sojourn does not include Abraham. And so when I did my chronology and figuring all the dates, I did not include Abraham. Instead, I went from when Jacob entered Egypt. Why? Because that's what the text most clearly seems to say. They are the ones who will sojourn. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. That seems pretty clear to me. Next issue, the temple initiation. When was the temple started? That's what I mean by that. Was it 480 years after the Exodus, or was it 440 years after the Exodus? Those are the two main textual variants that are there that you have to decide between. Alright, so in the article, I argue for 440 years being the time span that was originally in the text. And again, this goes back to which variant best explains the other ones. And the fact of the matter is that I can come up with reasons for why people would change 400 to 480, but I can't do the reverse. I can't explain why you would have 480 years and then reduce it to 440. I can't do that, but I can explain why somebody would take 440 years and make it 480. One reason why you might bump it up to 480 is because 480 is divisible by 12. And that's a number that is of Jewish significance. So the Masoretic scribes, being Jews, might be a little bit tempted to fudge the numbers a little bit so that they can draw something that is culturally and spiritually significant out of the text. Also, another thing that you have going on is that after the temple is done, you have the reign of Solomon, and Solomon's reign is a 40-year period. And the scribes might have added that onto the 440 just to make the whole period a little bit easier to deal with when you start doing chronologies. And the Masoretic scribes obviously were doing chronologies because they made flood year adjustments for Methuselah and things like that. So it's very clear that this is what they were doing. So it's possible that they tried to come up with a number that allowed them basically to skip over a smaller period of time. And granted, these explanations are somewhat tenuous. We don't know which one's the case or if either of them are. But the point is that these are explanations that could say why 440 became 480. I cannot for the life of me think why a scribe would intentionally change 480 to 440, though. 440 isn't the multiple of any biblically significant number. And also, there's no 40-year period that's nearby that you would want to subtract. There's a period nearby that you would want to add, Solomon's reign, but there's no reason that you would want to subtract it. So, based on that evidence, I would say that the case is strongest for 440 years being the original. And then finally, and I actually skipped one little period over there, and that's exactly how much of Solomon's reign do you count and all that, but that's fairly mundane, and most people agree on what that was, on what that period was, or at least the parameters of it, and there's only a few years difference that you can have on it anyway, so I'm not going to get into it. But the other major one is interpreting Ezekiel, which is a tough thing, and it basically comes down to, do you think that there was 390 years from the splitting of the kingdom up to the destruction of Jerusalem, or do you think that there's 380 years between the two events? I argue for 380 years. And this again has to do with which variant explains the others. The Septuagint text, when you read the germane passage in Ezekiel, it's in Ezekiel chapter 4, verses 4 through 6, by the way. And when you look through the Septuagint text, the thing is complicated, which would motivate later scribes to simplify it. There is no reason why you would take something that is simple and make it complicated. People don't do that in texts. You put things in to qualify things, you put things in to explain, you will condense the text down and to simplify it, but generally you're not going to take a text and make it more complicated on purpose. That being the case, the Septuagint reading is clearly the most original. And it's actually really hard to interpret as it normally is, and so I actually kind of had to play around with the punctuation. Not the wording, but I had to play around with how it's punctuated. And this is actually something that's valid to do in textual criticism, because the originals don't have a lot of punctuation in them. They don't really have periods and commas and things like we usually have, and parentheses and things like that. So I actually had to kind of play around with it a little bit to see actually what fit together between the two versions. And once I managed to get all of that synced up, what I found was that the Septuagint seems to indicate two 190-year periods. So you add that together, 190, 190, gives you 380, which is really close to what the Masoretic text has, 390. But it seems to be the more original reading. So that's what I go with. And granted that we're in Ezekiel, and Ezekiel does a lot of symbolic things, there's a chance that it might not be an exact precise number, but whatever the case was, it was close enough that his audience that was watching him do these things, because he was laying on his side for this period of days that corresponded to years and all this, it was close enough that the people who were watching this obviously understood what was going on. So even if it wasn't an exact number, it was certainly sufficiently close. Alright, so skipping all of the additions and all of the detailed analysis of all of the textual variants and all of that, this is the basic chronology that you come up with when you do all of those things. You wind up with creation occurring in the year 5368 BC, which is significantly earlier than most young Earth creationists go with, because most young Earth creationists default to the Masoretic text. And like I said, the Masoretic text is pretty good in most places. The problem has to do with numbers. The Septuagint scribes didn't really seem to care about the numbers all that much. They made very few intentional changes. They allowed difficulties to persist, like letting Methuselah live 14 years past the flood. They just didn't really bother with a lot of that stuff. They don't really exhibit a lot of fussiness on that level. And so, generally speaking, the Septuagint actually winds up recording the original numbers, or at least commends itself as recording the original numbers. That is certainly not the case with everything in the Septuagint. There's lots of things that are obvious additions and interpolations and qualifications and things like that. Lots of unoriginal material. But in the case of the numbers, at least for these numbers that we're looking at, the ones I've looked at, it seems like the best evidence is for them being the original numbers. And that moves the date of creation back. It doesn't move it back to millions or billions of years, certainly, but it does push it a little bit further back than most people think. We also wind up with a different flood year. The flood in this chronology occurs in the year 3106 BC. And like I said, that is mostly due to what happens with the patriarchs. They were getting moved around, and all that kind of stuff pushes it back a little bit. And like I said, that's a little bit further back than most young Earth creationists are used to. But I stand behind my numbers on that one. And like I said, in the sense of being able to explain later variants, I was able to do that. Whereas I've not seen anybody else actually start with the Masoretic text, which is what most people use, and use it to explain the later variants. I haven't seen anybody do that, so I'm going to stick with the numbers that I was able to argue for being original, and so I have a flood date that comes a lot sooner than most other young Earth creationist models would put it at. The Exodus is one that actually wound up being kind of interesting. My chronology puts it at 1444 BC, which is actually not too different from what you find in some study Bibles. Most study Bibles are kind of divided on where the Exodus is, because some people early date it, some people late date it, and it has to do with how you match it up with the Egyptian chronology and all that. And what's interesting is that, first of all, people who do all that chronology are usually very divided on it. Either it's the middle of the 15th century BC, or it's the middle of the 13th century BC. Nobody really puts it in the middle except for Steve Collins, and I actually followed along with his logic for a little while, and if you've seen my earlier stuff on it, you know that I did, but in retrospect, I would have to agree that there's a reason why it's one or the other and not something in between. And it turns out that this one goes with the earlier of the two. It's one that's in the mid-15th century. And this actually matches some research that was done in a documentary called Patterns of Evidence, The Exodus. And it's not necessarily the most scholarly documentary on the subject. It's not like it gives you tons and tons of research and all this, but it basically just documents some of the problems and whatnot. And what the evidence seems to best suggest, and their argument was that the evidence seems to best suggest a date somewhere in the middle of the 1400s BC. Which is what I got, is a date that's somewhere in the middle of the 1400s BC. So that is a nice little point of unity, if you will, and so that's encouraging. This chronology also puts the temple initiation at 1004 BC. This would be early in Solomon's reign, and this is a little bit earlier than most people put Solomon's reign. Most people put Solomon's reign a good 30 to 50 years afterwards. And that's possible, but it's also possible that there's a few gaps in the way that some people have worked out their chronologies for the Israeli kings, and so you could have this extra time in there. There's actually no particular reason why chronologists put Solomon where they do. There's no reason that he has to be there. And that being the case, I'm not going to apologize for this. And even if I am off, I'm only off by about 50 years at maximum, probably closer to about 30. So that really isn't bothering me all that much. And then finally you get the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC, and that's the date that I used to correlate everything. And people do disagree about that one a little bit. Some people say 584 should be used. Some people say 586, for example. Archbishop James Ussher, most people who dealt with young Earth chronology know Archbishop James Ussher. He used 584. A lot of modern reference material for the destruction of Jerusalem puts it at 586. It's only a 2-year difference, so I'm not all that concerned about it overall. But that does match up. But it is a fairly tight chronology in the sense that even though people do disagree about the date of the destruction of Jerusalem, it's only by a couple of years. It's not like it's decades. It's certainly not like it's centuries. Certainly isn't millennia. So it's fairly tight. So these are the numbers that I come up with. This is my new proposed chronology for the history of the Earth according to the Bible. It's a little bit different than a lot of young Earth creationists are used to. And all of these numbers are gained from the biblical texts. There's not a single part of this that is non-biblical. It's just not from biblical texts that most Protestants are used to dealing with. And that's the reason for the discrepancy. These are variants that don't get looked at very often, don't get looked at very thoroughly. And I got bored, and so I decided to look at it more thoroughly, and so I came up with something that was different. Anyways, before you jump to conclusions about whether or not you like this chronology or not, I would greatly appreciate it if you would actually first read the article that goes along with it. Like I said, look in the description of this video down at the bottom, and you'll see the description, and you'll see a link that goes to the article. Please actually read through the article before you make up your mind about which chronology you accept and which chronology you don't. Anyways, thank you very much for your time and for your patience. Go with God and be blessed. Amen.